On March 9th, 2018, Catholic blogger Matt Walsh published an op-ed on the Daily Wire titled, "Stop Pretending Violent Video Games Are Harmless Just Because You Like Playing Them." Since posting that article, he has received considerable feedback online. Some of those conversations touch on the key topic I'm interested in, the nature of violence and the purpose of violence in stories, art, and games, and the morals which undergird a particular story or game. Since the article came first, I've decided to discuss it first and my immediate thoughts, then follow up with Walsh's tweets to others on the topic. Mr. Walsh, if you choose to watch this, I'm someone who has read and followed your work for years. I haven't read every single post you've made, but when I've seen an article by you which begins to make the rounds, I always check it. I have memories going back to my time at a Christian university, where your original blog first began to go viral, and it became the heated topic of conversation at the lunch table. My progressive friends often shocked and outraged by your writing. My conservative friends and myself often laughing while defending some of your arguments. I think your bluntness and your style of writing helps prompt these kinds of debates. The reason I mention this is, given what you wrote about gamers being emotionally invested in their games and trying to justify their hobby, you might be wondering what's motivated me to respond to this article in particular. All I can say is that the topic interests me, and it's the first time I've seen an op-ed written by you go viral since I began to use YouTube to start expressing my thoughts on morality and popular entertainment. I think the fairest way to respond to you is to not try to rephrase your argument, but to go through your argument point by point. Before I do so, I want to be upfront about my initial impression. I think your article does touch on what I think are common sense considerations for any gamer and for Christian parents in particular about the effect of violence in media and addiction to entertainment. However, I think your argument fails to consider some crucial distinctions about the types of violence, the amounts of violence, and the purpose of violence in media. Because you speak very broadly about violence in games, it becomes hard to pin down which games or what genres of games you are concerned about. Ben Shapiro, the editor of the Daily Wire, has said about the gun control debate that he is always willing to have a debate on gun policy, but thinks that the debate should be rooted in an actual, specific policy proposal. I think there is wisdom to this. Rather than just debating whether we have a good feeling or a bad feeling in general about guns in America, a more fruitful debate would focus on a particular policy proposal and how precisely it seeks to prevent mass shootings and whether it would inhibit people's ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights. Before reading your article, I read your tweet clarifying the following. This piece is not about banning video games, never mentions laws, never mentions censorship, never argues that video games cause mass shootings. But anyway, please continue with the straw men. I understand that you are not writing about banning video games, but I think the wisdom of Ben Shapiro's advice to focus a cultural debate on something particular still holds true in this case. It would be better for everyone if we knew precisely which games we are talking about and the violent acts that you are particularly concerned with. It is not pointless to talk about violence in video games and other forms of media as a topic in and of itself without making a policy proposal to advance legislation. But without specifics, I see talking about violence in games as no more edifying than talking about gun culture in America without specifics. Is the debate over guns, school shooters, and the Second Amendment equivalent to talking about the representation of guns in games and movies? No. The gun debate is about the tools people use to do violence, whether they are misusing those tools to end life or using those tools to defend life by shooting mass shooters. The debate about violence in media is about whether we can see the effect of our media consumption in real life, whether violence in media might be a contributing factor in pushing some fringe individuals over the edge, and whether the total effect of the media, whether it's a book, a movie, or a game, is edifying to someone's soul or destructive to it. But when it comes to having a fruitful debate rather than having a fruitless debate, I think arguing based on specifics applies in both cases. To avoid the error of some online commenters, I'm now going to look at your article point by point. You begin by mentioning President Donald Trump's recent meeting to discuss violence in video games and complain that his position was being strawmanned as blaming mass shootings on video games. You underscore the point. To be clear, you are not defending the thesis that video games automatically cause children to commit mass shootings. In other words, you agree that video games are not a sufficient cause for mass shootings. Later in this article, you acknowledge that some mass shooters were not gamers, so games are not a necessary cause either. When you write, nobody thinks that video games are the only factor contributing to the problem. What is not stated, but may be fairly inferred, is that you think video games may be a factor among other factors contributing to mass shootings. You allude to pro-video game people. Which ones? Which arguments did they make? At any rate, these pro-video game people are incapable of responding to what you call an extremely logical and irrefutable argument. Paraphrasing President Trump, it is the idea that the internet and video games form people's minds and shape people's thoughts. I agree. Clearly, the content we consume, whether it's a song, an article, a book, a game, or a movie, must have some impact on our minds. Otherwise, why consume it in the first place? My questions are, what is the extent of that influence? How does that influence manifest itself in real life? And are all consumers created equal? I'll respond to these questions as they become relevant. I think this quote is the statement of your thesis for the rest of the op-ed. Of course, it isn't healthy for a child or anyone else to spend hours a day playing any sort of video game, least of all violent video games. What's important is we are talking about more than one type of thing. Children and adult consumers, where the impressionability of the consumer is a key issue, addiction or obsession over any type of game, where the hours played is a key issue, and violent video games, where the violent content, not the hours played, is the key issue. I did not appreciate how, in a paragraph questioning the value of scientific studies to quantifying something as deeply rooted as evil in the human mind, and suggesting that people could go round and round all day throwing studies at each other, that you still chose to link to a study by the National Center for Health Research. This begs the question of whether you want to debate studies or not. Do you consider the NCHR's study particularly important and worthy of discussion? Is that why you chose to include it? Given what you say about people going round and round with studies all day, would you consider it a fruitful use of your time to debate someone who has taken the time to read all these studies and evaluate them? I have not read these original studies. At most, I've read summaries of them in news publications. Given my interest in the topic, I may have to invest more time to become well-read on this part of the discussion. I would hope that I would not let my past enjoyment of a limited time playing video games bias me against scientific studies that might raise valid questions about the effects of violent content. I'd hope that a simple dislike of certain genres of video games wouldn't incline someone to dismiss scientific studies which seemingly demonstrate the opposite. A charitable interpretation of your argument in this paragraph might be that you're skeptical of people who have a prior agenda using studies to bolster an argument, maybe without even seriously reading the studies themselves. It's like using studies say or Google it as an argument. You're saying that there is a common sense aspect to this debate where we don't necessarily need to become experts in an entire field of scientific literature to talk about violence in games, and I agree. But by choosing to link to the NCHR, you seem to undermine your own point about not relying on these studies. It comes off as you saying, I'm not going to link to the study, which I've hyperlinked here so you know exactly which study I'm not going to link to. I think you've pulled the rug out from under your own feet a bit. After acknowledging that some mass shooters are not gamers, you alluded to the Sandy Hook shooter playing games and making 83,000 kills online. What game did he make those kills on? Reading the article you linked to, the game was Combat Arms. We now have a particular game we could talk about, and since the whole point of your article is concerned with the spiritual and moral effect games can and do have on people, I think it would be important to return to this type of game, first-person shooters. I have not played Combat Arms, but I will discuss my experience playing other first-person shooters, as that's what I think is the most relevant experience I have with the genre. I think it's important to note that the article you cited mentioned that the Sandy Hook shooter also also set up a shooting range for target practice, became obsessed with the military, and possessed photographs of mutilated corpses he hid under his bed. I've previously acknowledged that depiction of the use of guns in video games and the use of actual guns protected by the Second Amendment are two separate issues, which are not entirely parallel. But when it comes to the use of rhetoric and how news media presents information, I think this is an entirely fair question to ask. What if the Daily Mail had chosen a headline and focused the story on the Sandy Hook shooter's obsession with the Marines and his use of a physical shooting range? What if academic leftists focused on these details and argued that conservative obsession with the Second Amendment and gun culture contributed to the Sandy Hook shooter's act of mass murder? What if they blamed his obsession with the Marines and on the military-industrial complex and the positive portrayal of the American military in popular children's media like G.I. Joe comic books and cartoons? Would you find that rhetoric objectionable, whether it was stated directly or couched in more careful language? Something along the lines of, I'm not saying G.I. Joe causes children to murder people. I'm saying its positive portrayal of the American military may be a contributing factor to obsession with the Marines and with gun violence. You later will state that you think personal commitment to video games is causing some of your critics to strawman your argument. I think it's entirely possible for people who love video games to allow that love to cloud an argument which seems to criticize their hobby or profession. However, I think one key reason you have been receiving a lot of comments criticizing your op-ed is that gamers have recently heard arguments which sound very familiar to yours coming from the progressive intersectional left. This is the reason I think specific games and specific depictions of violence within games are more important to discuss. Talking broadly about violence in games while referring to first-person shooters as a genre sounds a lot like feminists talking about sexism and misogyny in games while referring to things as innocuous as heroic knights doing violence to evil monsters to save fair princesses. Yes, you can make clear distinctions between the two positions. Yes, the two topics are about very different things, but they overlap enough that it is understandable that your critics' minds will go to popular left-wing feminist critics of video games when your arguments have superficial similarities. The only way you can address this and make your argument stronger is to address specific examples within particular video games. You can't dismiss this criticism merely by saying it can only come from a place of personal bias in favor of games. You write, are you going to tell me that you are positive his hours upon hours upon hours spent stewing in virtual violence had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with his murder spree? No, I'm not. Are you going to tell me that you're positive his obsession with the Marines and military target practice had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with his murder spree? Again, your lack of specifics is hurting you. You've opened this entire op-ed by talking about pro-video game people strawmanning Donald Trump. Who are the pro-video game people arguing that the Sandy Hook shooter's obsession with death and combat arms had nothing to do with his depraved desire to commit murder? Did you get a few comments from random gamers on Twitter arguing this? Did a significant voice in gaming like Mark Kern or Christina Hoff Sommers argue this? Who are you talking to? Who are you talking about who said this? You write in response to these undefined people who argue that playing violent video games has no connection with the Sandy Hook shooter's desire to commit murder, and how are you going to prove that? With a study? A survey of some other parents and kids will tell me what was going on in the dark recesses of the Sandy Hook school shooter's mind? Well, since this is not my position, and I agree with you that the Sandy Hook shooter's fascination with combat arms came from a fascination with death and murder and a desire to commit similar acts in real life, I'm not going to argue that. I think what was going on in the dark recesses of the Sandy Hook shooter's mind was the same thing going on in Cain's mind when he murdered Abel. You then transition to talking about common sense in connection to this issue. I have used the language of common sense myself when talking about certain topics, but I think we have to be careful about when and why we refer to common sense when making an argument. I'm sure you are aware that proponents of gun control often call it common sense gun control. Certain new atheists, when mocking religious beliefs, might appeal to common sense as a way of substantiating their mockery. I think the value of common sense is for things like crossing the street or chatting with friends and relatives. When I cross the street or drive in traffic, I rely on what common sense says about green and red traffic lights or walking men and the orange hand symbol. I do not need to become an expert in scientific studies on traffic safety and chart a graph of traffic deaths in connection with people ignoring these lights to figure out that I'm safer obeying the signs. Common sense lets me talk about topics I may not be an expert in, but use logic to consider what I hear. I may not be as well versed in a topic as someone else, but common sense can protect me from accepting bad or contradictory arguments just because it comes from someone who sounds smart while they talk about a subject. You write, here's what common sense tells me. A moderate video game habit, not involving graphic and violent games, will not harm a child. I agree. When I was young, my parents had a rule that I had to earn every hour of video games I ever played with an hour of reading. As a result, I became a voracious reader, at first just because I wanted to earn that privilege, and then because I became absorbed in reading. I think parents need to be focused and responsible on this front, and they cannot expect the gaming industry to come into their house and regulate their children's time playing games for them. I really don't disagree with this entire segment of your op-ed. You seem to think that 1 hour of gaming a day is too much. I would suggest that just like some hobbies require more time than other hobbies, some games require more of a time commitment than other games. And this can be to the credit of the game. If you can play a few rounds of Mario Kart in under an hour, a game like Civ might take a few hours to complete because of the strategy involved. The only quibble I'd have with you saying games should not be played daily is, what if there's a family which uses games as the functional equivalent of playing Monopoly, where there is a familial bonding aspect to the gaming? If Mario Kart is the equivalent of playing Hungry Hungry Hippos with the kids, a strategy game like Civ is more like playing Risk or Settlers of Catan with older teens. In this example, the time spent gaming isn't merely spent gaming, there's a social dimension to it. I didn't game with my parents, but on the occasions I gamed with my siblings, we didn't just stare blankly at a screen. We conversed with each other. We competed and learned that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. There's no participation trophy. We collaborated on games that required people to work together. We thought critically about games which required logical and strategic thinking to overcome a challenge. In these situations I'm describing, the time committed to playing a game is a vehicle for having fun in a social setting where communication is key, which seems to be a very different kind of time commitment than just playing alone in your room. You write, as a human being with a brain, I am able to determine that a child should not spend every moment of his free time escaping into virtual reality. He should be a human being doing human things. All of this time in video game land isolates him. I agree. Because I've read your work on your original blog and The Blaze, I have some context on your religious beliefs, which you don't state explicitly in this op-ed. But I think it's important to understanding where you're coming from. Jesus said of the love of money that no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. While this isn't specifically about movies, books, or video games, it's easy to see we could violate the spirit of this teaching by obsessing over these things. I love the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. I believe they promote good morals, and the experience of reading them, or even watching the Peter Jackson films, is edifying and constructive. There's nothing wrong with becoming particularly enthusiastic about the world created by Tolkien or getting geeky about it. I think the word obsession or addiction only describes someone who has such an unhealthy interest in Middle-earth that they want to die and go there, or they isolate themselves from all human contact to try to imagine themselves within Middle-earth to the point their real lives begin to fall apart. No matter how fundamentally good Tolkien's imaginary world is, it can be harmful if it becomes an idol. And I think you are right, Mr. Walsh, that parents of children and adults need to consider when their hobbies and passions are becoming more than a source of pleasure and instead become all-consuming and destructive. Because it can be hard to be honest with yourself about whether you're spending your time well. I was very influenced in this respect by the ministry of John Piper and his book, Don't Waste Your Life. One impactful illustration he used was of an old couple who spent their retirement with decades of play and pleasure on the beach. Then when they come before God at the seat of judgment, they show him their seashell collection, and this is the sum total of what they accomplished with their limited time on earth. This illustration really struck me, and I began to think much more critically about how I use my time and how to live my life in such a way that at the end, I will not merely have lived for my own pleasure, but my life will have meant something of value to others, that I will have left something behind me that will be fruitful for the generations who come after me. When I think about what that might be exactly, I usually think of the value of art and stories and how they instill certain values within me. This is one reason I'm so concerned over the topic of morality in games, stories, and comics, even though I now only play games for about 2 hours per month. This segues nicely into the topic of violent content in video games, the extent to which it is graphically violent as opposed to cartoonishly violent, and the purpose of the violence for the effect of the total work. You yourself say that you do not restrict this topic to only kids. It is not good or healthy for anyone to play graphic, disturbing, gory video games. I agree, but once again, by what metric do you measure the degree of graphicness or the amount of it in one game, whether it's one particular moment in a largely bloodless game or continual throughout the game? It's entirely fair to speak generally about a subject if you don't want to delve into specifics, but without specific references to what you're talking about, people are going to wonder just how far this definition could possibly stretch. If the point you are making is that some games celebrate violence for the sake of celebrating death and gore, then it is particularly important for you to talk about a specific game and its details, because that is a judgment on the total effect of the work. We could point to objective details in this game or that movie, bloody handprint there, gruesome torture scene there, but if the argument is about something's total effect, we need to understand how that detail is used and why it's there. While operating under a vague description of violence in video games, you continue that it will not make you a better person, and the effect likely isn't neutral. When you write, nothing is really neutral for human beings. Everything we do either makes us better or worse. I agree. My earlier allusion to J.R.R. Tolkien was meant to illustrate how the same good thing, depending on how it was used, could make many people better, but some people worse. In your tweets written after this article, I've seen you discuss types of media or literature which include verbal descriptions or visual depictions of violence as part of a larger narrative, and argue that the cumulative effect of the work, whether it's telling a story of redemption or heroism in the face of evil or in times of war, must be taken into consideration. I plan to go through those tweets after looking at this article so I can focus on the points made in this article as it was written and published. Looking at this quote, I frankly think this is the point in your article where you buried what should have been a common sense point. This is where some video game apologists devolve into incoherence. Video games are a sacred cow because people are desperate to justify the last 8,000 hours of their lives that they wasted on them. So they'll often pretend there is nothing toxic about violent games at all. They'll say something silly like, "It's just pretend. I'm just shooting at pixels. It's not turning me into a serial killer." No matter what you wrote in response to your critics following this op-ed to clarify your position, this op-ed, on its own merits, fails to consider how violence may be used in video games as part of a bigger picture where the total effect is healthy or constructive. It fails to define the nature or extent of violence, leaving us only to guess that maybe you're talking about first-person shooters, or maybe you're talking about any game set in times of war. And your allusions to slasher flicks and violent torture porn literature only serve to underscore this failure to consider that there are key distinctions between violence and gore for the sole sake of enjoying violence and gore in video games, and violence in video games for what I think, as a matter of common sense, Mr. Walsh, is entirely healthy for young adults and particularly young men in an age where masculinity is being treated as a kind of leprosy to be cured by intersectional academic leftism. I'm not a big first-person shooter fan. I'm mostly a fan of strategy games like Fire Emblem, but all of the first-person shooters I've played to completion are not about letting me simulate the joys of murdering people. They are heroic soldier simulators, sometimes for fantastical situations like the Halo series, sometimes for more realistic situations like Call of Duty, which allow me to play a game where I imagine myself as a brave American soldier fighting terrorists and defending innocent life, or defending Earth from an advancing horde bent on Earth's destruction. The problem with your rhetorical tactic is, if people have played Halo or Call of Duty and enjoyed those games, you now have a basis for dismissing them as game apologists, devolving into incoherence based on their predisposition to justify their time wasted on games. As I mentioned before, I spend about 2 hours a month on video games these days, and I don't play first-person shooters, largely because I see them as a social game for young people to play together and test their competitive spirit. During my time in college, I probably played about 3 hours a week of Halo and Call of Duty with college classmates, working our way collaboratively through the campaigns and playing online matches. Is that enough for me to meet the threshold of being incoherent and so emotionally invested in first-person shooters that I blindly defend them? Or is that just an indication that I've played enough of these two game series to know that the core appeal of them is not to imagine yourself as a serial killer, indulging your desire to kill innocent people indiscriminately? The appeal of these games is playing at soldiering. It's a hero fantasy. It's you imagining that in the event you were drafted or volunteered to enter a major war, whether it's aliens or Nazis, that you would have the moral virtue to risk your life and conduct yourself courageously in battle. This is the key distinction between the appeal about violence in certain types of stories and more torture porn types of stories. Later, we will see you talk about this in more detail in your tweets defending your thesis. There are aspects of games that are similar to movies, and some games have a story mode where a story is told. But the core appeal of the gameplay I'm talking about is to imagine yourself as someone strong who is defeating someone evil to save someone innocent. That is why we need specifics. If you spoke about a particular game and its content, you might have a really strong case that the total effect of that game is not positive or wholesome. If you used a Japanese hentai game that was about torture or murder or rape, you'd have an example of something which is self-evidently not wholesome, which has no redeeming value. But because you've spoken broadly about violence in video games without naming the games of concern to you, everyone's going to wonder just how far the implications of your argument go. You write, "We all know it's pretend. We all know the images are digital. We know you are not a serial killer, but the fact remains that you still enjoy pretending to kill people. Your favorite recreational activity is to pretend that you are killing people. My favorite game is Fire Emblem, Path of Radiance for the Nintendo GameCube. Its story mode is the equivalent of a light fantasy novel for young adults. Nothing at the level of Tolkien, but the themes of its story are fundamentally moral and virtuous. You play as a group of patriotic mercenaries who are defending the Princess of Crimea, a fictional Crimea with no connection to the actual nation, from an invading totalitarian army led by a mad tyrant. On your journey, you encounter racism toward your own race and toward races of men with animal characteristics. You encounter a theocratic nation. You witness the effects of genocide. You invade and conquer the tyrannical nation which launched an unprovoked war of aggression on your nation, liberate your home country, and restore the princess to her throne and restore peace to the realm. What you wrote in the previous paragraph is technically correct, but rhetorically devious. It is technically correct that if someone enjoys playing Halo, to use your words, they still enjoy pretending to kill people. But if I play a game like Fire Emblem, which does not feature blood and guts, and does not feature a first-person perspective with a gun, it is still technically correct to say that I am enjoying playing a game where I kill people. The game is about times of war. You have to kill enemy soldiers who are trying to kill you. The problem I think most people have with your article is not that it is common sense, Mr. Walsh, but that by speaking generally about violence in video games, we do not have an indication of what precisely you're talking about. I'm sure if you either watched Let's Plays of Fire Emblem or played it yourself, you would object that of course you didn't have this game in mind and that I'm putting words in your mouth. I want to be clear that I am not putting words in your mouth. The problem I have with your article isn't that I think you are incapable of distinguishing between a largely innocuous fantasy about anime soldiers and a 3D game about space marines shooting aliens from a first-person perspective. My point is that, looking at your article on its own merits, without bringing in additional context, the words you've written, taken at face value, seem to have quite a bit more reach beyond the graphic, violent games you are so concerned with. This is why people are asking you about Saving Private Ryan. This is why people are asking you about murder mysteries, or whether people read Sherlock Holmes because they love to fantasize about cocaine injections, or whether people read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment because they enjoy imagining young Russian law students rationalizing first-degree murder. I'm sure some of your critics just want to strawman you and dismiss you because thinking about violence in games makes them uncomfortable. But the logic of the argument you are making has implications, and people can see those implications as applied to other games and other media. Because of your choice not to talk about particulars, you've written about violence in media in a way that leaves me wondering whether my enjoyment of the Halo franchise, or my enjoyment of the Fire Emblem franchise, or my enjoyment of the movie Dunkirk could be explained as something which is, quote, not good. It's still unhealthy. It's still pretty disturbing that you find so much joy in simulated death and destruction. I say the same thing about people who love bleak, graphic, torture porn movies. I agree with you on the matter of torture porn movies. Later you talk about how, under peer pressure, you watched the movie Hostel and regretted it. I have not had that experience. The closest was a college roommate playing the movie Saw in the room while I was already working on homework. I didn't watch the movie, but I picked up enough from the sound to know it was not the type of movie I could ever find edifying or good. The problem is, because of your vagueness, without even mentioning first-person shooter games as the genre, the reference point most of us have in our minds from your reference to the Sandy Hook shooter and the picture above the article is a generic first-person shooter set in wartime. The reason people are bringing up the depiction of violence in epic war movies, which strive for realism, is not that they are apologists for video games incapable of critical self-reflection. The reason people are bringing up war movies in comparison to war games is there is a common sense distinction between a game which depicts violence in wartime by soldiers in combat and a video game which is a bleak, violent, pornographic fantasy like a Japanese hentai in the form of a game. Just as there is a distinction between the depiction of violence, death, and evil in a World War II film about overcoming evil and in a torture porn film which celebrates the evil as the primary reason for watching it. It is not common sense to compare first-person shooters about World War II to torture porn books and movies. It is common sense to note the distinction between a game like Fire Emblem, where the appeal is playing a soldier in wartime so that I may act heroically and restore peace through my martial virtue, and a violent hentai game. If I can imagine myself as a strong and heroic individual defeating evil, that core appeal is healthy, and it's healthy whether I'm playing a little weeby guy with an unrealistically big sword or a marine with a semi-realistic 3D gun. This is the critical possibility I think your whole article fails to consider, that maybe, just maybe, when people play Halo, they're not playing it just to scratch their murder itch. This is why I think it's important when you say, that's one of the major effects the violent video games and movies certainly do have on a person. They feed the twisted part of his brain that delights in ugliness. Because what I know I delight in is heroic fantasies about fighting the forces of evil. I thought this was your weakest segment in the entire article. Again, I agree with a lot of the substance of what you've written, including thinking about desensitization. A person should be horrified by brutality and violence, you write. We should be sickened by it. I am sickened by it. You write, we should not take pleasure in it, and neither should we be neutral toward it. I am not neutral towards evil. I think it needs to be defeated. I think young people need to have inculcated within themselves a courageous desire to oppose evil, to slay dragons, and rescue the innocent. If a young man takes pleasure in slaying pretend evil dragons and majestically standing sword in the air, I don't think it's neutral to take pleasure in that kind of fantasy. I think it is positively good. And we need a good dose more of it in a culture when young men have become emasculated. You write, it's clear that a lot of kids today, a lot of people generally, have a certain numbness, a certain emptiness inside of them. Yes, and the absence of first-person shooter games will not fix that problem. Since you are a Catholic, Mr. Walsh, I hope you would enthusiastically agree with me that the presence of Christ is a much more important thing to focus on in relation to that question than the absence of violent video games, in a way which is parallel to my analogy about obsessing over J.R.R. Tolkien's World of Middle-earth. Fascination with playing at soldier can be the mark of a healthy young person who fantasizes about improving himself and defeating evil, or the mark of an unhealthy young mind which glorifies in the violence out of a love for destruction. You write, they do not recoil at evil. They do not feel disgust at disgusting things. This is at least partially because they spend so much of their time in a disgusting virtual world, pretending to do disgusting things for fun. I think an important aspect of what I'm talking about is how games, stories, movies, comic books, what have you, have a morality. And if that morality includes fighting evil, that heroic action assumes you have the capacity to perform violence if necessary. You are right that I don't want anyone, and young people especially, desensitized to violence to the point they are numb to the world and separated from the real world and from ideas of life and beauty. To use a fantastical example, if I was journeying through the world of Middle-earth and I saw some of Sauron's orcs murdering a hobbit father, and nearby is his family cowering in terror, me being desensitized to violence would mean I'd numbly ignore it. Life is meaningless. Life is nothing but endless death. There's nothing I can do. The opposite extreme is oversensitivity. If I see the dead hobbit father and I'm so gut-wrenched by the blood and the gore, I might run away as fast as I can and leave the rest of the hobbits to their fate like a coward. I want to have just enough stoicism so that when I see the dead hobbit father and I see the orc turning to the hobbit children, I can desensitize my initial reaction of disgust just enough so that I can defeat that freaking orc and save those hobbits. Maybe I had to desensitize myself to violence first by practicing daily with wooden swords with an elven instructor who'd hit me with the wooden sword until I got good enough to hit him back. When we are talking about a person who is filled with joy and love for life and a desire to serve and protect others, including strangers, and not about a person obsessed with ugliness and emptiness and death, then the capacity to do violence and honing your body and mind to be better at doing violence is not morally neutral, but morally good. I do not think that first-person shooter games can instill those values by themselves, but in combination with a healthy respect for beauty and human life, games can serve to reinforce good values like healthy competitiveness, no participation trophies here, or play acting at defeating evil and defending good. I'm sure you could find a list of particular games which seem to celebrate evil, but in a genre as broad as first-person shooters, all I can say about the ones I've played is that their appeal was something similar to what I've described. I start with the foundation that I love human life and primarily want to live my life in service to others and in defense of human dignity. Because of that, the appeal of Halo or Call of Duty is the appeal of imagining oneself for a brief time as a stronger person who must make sacrifices to defend life. This aspect of gaming doesn't need to be expressed in movie cutscenes in the game. It is true based on the mindset of the one playing the game. If the gamer is forced to murder a bunch of innocent people, the game will lose its appeal. If the game affords them the choice of murdering a bunch of innocent people or saving a bunch of innocent people, the gamer will choose in accordance with why they wanted to play the game in the first place. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. If the game has no story, but has a generic setup for multiple players to compete with each other, perhaps to capture the flag, the player will bring their assumptions about life and the value of life, whether good or bad, into the game with them. After you say that video games are not the only culprit when it comes to desensitization, you add, but they are a culprit. And for some people, the people who play a lot of video games, and especially a lot of very violent video games, they probably are a major culprit. I agree. The particular thing someone loves the most on an emotional level is going to be the hardest for them to evaluate on a rational level to decide if it is healthy. Quote, I believe that everything I've said here is rather self-evident. The people who lash out against it mostly do so because they want to defend their own recreational interests. I believe that the point about valuing light over darkness, and beauty over ugliness, and life over death is self-evident. I believe this common sense point has become rather mixed up entirely with a broad brush association of violent video games with torture porn and the expression of condescension towards pro-video game people. I hope that as you receive criticism and responses to this piece, you will be able to distinguish between people who are just trying to defend their hobby as a knee-jerk reaction, which I identify with because I have enjoyed this hobby, and those who examine what you've written critically to make an argument without strawmanning your position. You made clear that you are not interested in a debate over this or that study, and as long as you stick to that avenue of discussion is closed off to a lot of people. You made the allusion to common sense and argued about something which I think is more deeply significant than scientific attempts to understand the effects of video games on people's behavior. Good and evil. And being considerate about how we use our time and what we celebrate in our media. I'll close my response to your op-ed with this. I think it is self-evident and a matter of pure common sense that if a group of American soldiers work together to kill a group of ISIS terrorists, whether we are talking about ground forces or the Air Force, if they successfully kill the terrorists, finish their tours of duty, and go home, and as a way of celebrating their return, they play a first-person shooter game with a group of friends where they pretend to kill video game terrorists or invading alien or zombie hordes, that there is something fundamentally parallel about the real-life activity and the appeal of the fantasy game. If a conservative is convinced of the inherent value of martial virtues and the armed forces and real-life military work, perhaps they should consider not just the violence of the video games which imitate military action, but whether the gamer playing the game does so out of an unhealthy interest in death or a healthy interest in martial virtue. With that, I'd like to look at your tweets in response to some of the criticism you've received to see if this clarifies anything we've read. You write to Nick Papas that something we should do is make the choice to do something constructive with our lives instead of playing with a toy for hours a day. I agree. Nick Papas, though, was asking you, now what? Because of the general nature of your op-ed potentially having broad implications. Nick Papas did not say you were advocating for laws to restrict video game purchases. He expressed a general concern for what the implications of the logic of your piece might be. Mr. Walsh, I have heard you repeatedly talk about the straw manning of your work. Why did you think talking about doing something constructive with our lives and not playing with a toy for hours a day is a response which speaks to what Mr. Papas wrote? What about his tweet or his entire timeline indicates to you that he spends hours of his day on toys and does not believe we need to accomplish something constructive with our lives? You wrote to one commentator that there is nothing wrong with watching a 2-hour movie, something wrong with watching a 2-hour movie every day of your life, unless it's literally your job. I agree. T. Greg Doucette asked you, curious, what did you think the Cowboys were doing when kids played Cowboys and Indians? Probably indicating that these games are about imaginary killing. I'd add to Mr. Doucette that the whole point of the game is that both sides kill each other. You write back, curious, did your games of Cowboys and Indians typically involve simulated blood and human entrails? That's a fair point. This is something that would be relevant to consider whether we are talking about descriptions of gore in writing, depictions of gore in film, and in games. Children playing Cowboys and Indians is quite different than Call of Duty, which is why I'm against 12-year-olds playing Call of Duty and think parents should carefully monitor their children's activities. But which game are you talking about? Call of Duty Bully didn't throw human entrails in my face, nor did Halo. This is the problem of the lack of specifics coming back again. You write, the criticism I wrote about video games yesterday was actually pretty mild and heavily qualified, but that didn't stop folks from calling for my firing and suicide over video games. What a country. Yes, Mr. Walsh, on an internet where people can speak anonymously, you can receive many vapid or mean-spirited comments. Amazingly, advocates of video games have been known to get a few from critics of video games. It is a general observation that most online conversations, even ones over seemingly petty or innocuous subjects, often devolve into vitriol online. Your piece was qualified, but so generalized as to be the statement of a truism. I'm against bad games. I'm for good games. Well, which ones are the bad ones, and what criteria do we use to measure badness or the total effect of the work? This tweet is one of the most interesting. My position, you shouldn't play video games all day, and gory video games aren't good for kids. That's pretty much the extent of it, but even that is too much for the people who have made these things into their idols. However, you explicitly stated in the article that violent video games are not just bad for kids. You argued that video game obsession in general was a problem for kids, which could include an obsession with an innocuous game like Paper Mario, then went on to talk about violence and desensitization as a problem for adult gamers too. Some people may object to you saying that because video games are their idols, and some may object because you effectively compared first-person shooter games to torture porn, and because they recognize meaningful and real distinctions between those two things. Hayden Hewitt writes to you that it's amazing you wrote all this without even looking into why people like to be scared, horrified, or repulsed. You respond, the desire to be horrified and repulsed is not healthy and should not be indulged. I agree. I have never watched a slasher flick for this reason. I don't know what Mr. Hewitt was getting at, but all I'd add is the appeal of fantasy violence should be the appeal of defeating evil, and that inherent to that idea is doing violence to the evil. The reason that a lot of Christian movies come off as treacly garbage is evil is presented as a cartoonish idea, not a reality. The atheist character is the evil thing, but not something like fundamental brokenness in a Christian family. Good narratives and games which depict evil have to walk a fine line between celebrating and glorifying the evil on one hand or whitewashing the evil on the other hand. It's the screw tape letters dilemma. It's why specifics help your argument. You continue your conversation with Mr. Hewitt, where he brings up a point which has some similarity to things I've tried to express in this response. What about violence in narratives? He writes, what about tales involving beheadings, the occult, cannibalism, and shape-shifting? Should they not be indulged? I mean, we call them fairy tales, but they're horrific and scary, so therefore bad, right? You, sir, are guilty of ignorant clickbait. Mr. Hewitt is accusing you of using a sort of shocking rhetoric to generate clicks and ad revenue. He's alluding generally to these kinds of stories without mentioning any specifically. You write in response, what don't you understand about the distinction between a story that incorporates violence in service of a worthwhile and redemptive plot, and a story where the violence is the entire point and the sole or primary source of entertainment? Exactly. Some games, like my allusion to Fire Emblem, Path of Radiance, have a story which gives context to the violence. In Fire Emblem's case, the violence becomes noble and virtuous because we understand it in the context of a narrative about opposing an evil dictatorship launching an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation. The problem with games is that they overlap with movies and stories a little bit in this respect, but insofar as they are games we play, they don't overlap. If I set up a custom match of a game similar to Fire Emblem with another player, we are not experiencing a story. We are competing with each other using strategy. The violence may be identical, but we are experiencing it in a different context. The most pertinent illustration I can think of from games I've played is the story campaign for Halo 1 through 3 versus playing multiplayer games of Halo with friends. The story gives the characters and the world context that I bring into the multiplayer game. Is multiplayer a real battle? Is it a mock battle where the soldiers are in training? Those kinds of meta concerns are pretty minor, since the multiplayer experience is more about talking with friends. You communicate strategies, you roast the person who lost, you praise the person who did something spectacular and won the game for your team. I see this as fundamentally parallel to getting some foam swords and practicing sword fighting with each other, or going out to the shooting range and practicing on a target that's vaguely human looking. You're not wallowing in violence and destruction. You are building camaraderie and practicing competitive skills. By the way, I don't even think the most realistic first-person shooters I've played have much benefit in training someone to use a weapon because it's a fantasy. It doesn't teach you to reload a weapon or turn off the safety or how to properly hold your gun so the recoil doesn't knock you over. It teaches you to press a button to reload. The competitive aspect is what makes it appealing to most people who are talking to you. Which leads us to this tweet. The point of watching Saw is to see people get cut to pieces. The point of watching Saving Private Ryan is to see good conquer evil. The latter is healthy, the other is not. Why is everyone struggling so much with this extremely simple nuance? Exactly. I agree with this 100%. The movie Saving Private Ryan was impactful to me as I was growing up, but comparing the two, I think the movie Dunkirk is a million times better in terms of having a meaningful message about the triumph of good over evil. So that's the movie I'd prefer to give free press if we're going to talk about this. This is the key distinction I see between first-person shooters, which let people pretend to be American soldiers fighting Nazis, and torture porn games. If this was your last word on the subject of games, I think it's a very good word to end on. But what I hope you will consider is this. For every violent and depraved mind who watched the movie Dunkirk out of a desire to watch actors being blown up in a semi-realistic way, or watch a soldier drown and relish in that moment, there are thousands of moviegoers who saw that movie because they wanted to experience a depiction of what it might have been like to be at Dunkirk, to witness the death and destruction, but to persist in defense of a noble ideal as articulated by Churchill at the end of the film. And just as the Sandy Hook shooter you alluded to might have played first-person shooters out of a fascination with death and mutilation, many who play those video games which contain violence play them not out of a grim fascination with death and entrails, which describes none of the popular first-person shooters I've played, but out of a desire to imagine themselves as a more powerful hero, capable of defeating evil in the name of a higher ideal. Thank you for listening. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. If you enjoyed this response, you can help support this channel's growth by sharing your thoughts in the comments, liking this video, and by subscribing and clicking the bell icon to receive notifications when I publish new videos. You will find an archive link to Mr. Walsh's op-ed and the relevant tweets in the description below. Sorry, Matt, but no clicks for you. Oh, gosh. I hate this whole thing about Grand Theft Auto.